Well, thank you again. I'm very happy to be part of this webinar series, especially on this topic around the practice of operations research. I have been very fascinated by this topic, especially on the challenges around implementation. So I'm very grateful to have this opportunity. And what I've done is kind of break the problem down into two parts. So what I would call the last mile problem, and then having to go the extra mile. And the reason I do that is partly because of my background. I've worked for about 20 years in manufacturing and supply chain before coming to FICO, and I've been at FICO about 5 years. And in my experience, as I led OR teams at companies, as we were developing models, it seemed to get easier, never easy, but it seemed to get better and better as we were able to get more data, build bigger models, and create models. But it always felt like the deployment of those models was still a challenge. And for anybody that's worked in supply chain, you're familiar with the last mile problem, or even in telecommunications, where the last mile problem is this challenge of kind of going that final step on, connecting the last nodes in the network so that you can actually, achieve what you want to achieve. And similarly, in deploying OR projects, that last mile problem was the actual deployment or operationalizing of those models for end users. And I think it's gotten much better in the last 5 or 7 or 10 years. Early in my career, in the early 2000s, it felt like when I would go to an Informs conference and we were talking about deploying models, rather than finding solutions, it was more like a group therapy session. People would complain about IT and this and that. So you felt good, like you were not the only one with the problem, but it was still a problem. But I feel these days that deployment piece has gotten better, where now you can deploy models in weeks or months instead of months and years. And it's solved with a combination of where technology has taken us over the last 10 years, as well as maybe a change in thinking as well, so more lean thinking type of approach. My background is in industrial engineering, and just looking at the overall process in terms of how we go from data to models to deployment, turning that into much shorter cycle times, more iterative, so you don't get into these projects with very large sets of requirements, and the first time the end user sees something, maybe 6 or 8 months from now, we can quickly build prototypes, quickly deploy those, get people to test them, work with them, and quickly point out what they like, what they don't like. And then again, in another quick cycle, come back and say, okay, so is this better? Is this better? So I think the last mile problem, through a combination of technology and lean thinking, has gotten a lot better over the last few years. And overall, the real focus is on improving decision quality, whether that be the speed of how fast you can, solve a model, or it may be just the speed from what we call, whiteboard to dashboard, right? From the time you have an idea to the time somebody can actually look at the results on a dashboard and maybe run scenarios around it so they can get more comfortable with a solution. So that's the last mile problem. I'm not going to focus a lot on that because I think what the next challenge becomes is what I call going the extra mile. So I used to think once we resolve the deployment problem, then we would be able to deploy optimization projects fast and furiously all over the place. But if there was still a challenge, and that sort of led me to this thinking of, okay, if we conquer the last mile, it seems like we have to go one more mile. And that's the problem of adoption. And adoption basically requires change. So for somebody to use an optimization model, they typically have to change how they've been working, how they've been thinking, and change is never easy. So I like to use the phrase, the politics of analytics, and I'm going to spend most of this webinar talking about that, the politics of analytics. So I purposely chose this phrase because politics has a general sort of feeling that it creates in people, and it tends to be a little bit sort of used negatively, right? You talk about office politics or politics, but analytics is what we do, and obviously it has a nice rhyme to it, and that is for a positive thing. So there's this conflict between something that may feel a little more negative to do something that we want to do more positive. I am not here to necessarily make a value statement about politics. I came to the conclusion that it's a very human condition. When there are forces or powers within any organization, the larger they get, the more interesting it seems to get. It's going to be there. So if I can't find a magical way to get rid of it, maybe we need to find a way to manage it and find a way to work with it, so we can actually get the good that we want to get done out of it. So I start with maybe a quote. This one may be very familiar to many of you. In God we trust, all others must bring data, attributed to Mr. Deming back in the quality era, total quality management. And this one is very personal to me, because when I got my first job out of grad school, my boss had this on his desk, but it was not facing him. It was obviously facing me. So every time I sat at my boss's desk, I would see this. And it was, as a young engineer, it was very clear, right? I mean, I would get the data, I would build some models, I would do some analysis, and that should be the end of the story, right? The data should speak and tell us what to do, and then I would move on to the next one. Early in my career, I didn't get as involved in sort of seeing where all of that went. But as my career progressed, I started to see that, even though we might have built a really good model, we might have done good analysis, it didn't always turn out the way we thought it was going to turn out. And I was puzzled, like, why, right? Deming said, in God we trust, all others bring data. Well, then I came across this other quote, which was something I was feeling, but I couldn't quite put into words. And this one sentence by Peter Drucker, to me, really sort of captured it so beautifully. There's culture eats strategy for breakfast. And here you can replace, strategy with solution or model, whatever. But I was starting to realize that the culture within an organization or even within a group was so important to how these models get absorbed, used, implemented. And I started to focus much more on this idea of really what is happening, politically in that organization when it comes to looking at implementing these models. So Drucker and Deming, both gurus that have been around for many, many, many years. Their work has been around for many, many years. But then last year, I came across this Harvard Business Review article. The title of the article was "Building the AI-Powered Organization. The Main Challenge Isn't Technology, It's Culture." And within that article, one of the main sort of call-outs was that their data show, this is McKinsey, all the authors are from McKinsey, and they said the data shows that only 8% of firms are engaging in core practices that support widespread adoption. So this adoption problem, this culture problem is still existing today. So what can we do to try to manage it better? So I will talk about 5 strategies for conquering the politics of analytics, and conquering may be a very optimistic term. It may be managing, might be a more practical term, but if you can conquer it, fantastic. And I purposely used this sort of scary font in the middle. It was Halloween here in the US just on Saturday. So it can be a little scary, but if we do these 5 things, I think we can make it less scary. So it's not going to go away. And I'll talk about each one of these 5 things as we get to the next slide. So again, it's not going to go away, but hopefully it becomes something that we can understand, manage, and work with to make sure that our projects are implemented and have the benefit and the potential, and realize the potential benefit that optimization can bring. So in a longer version of this presentation, I have more on each one of these bullet points, but I've tried to summarize it to sort of some of the core messages for each one. So I'll go through each one. And of course, this is not a topic that I think will ever be sort of completely, solved. There's always good conversations to be had about this and new ideas. So I really look forward to any questions you might have, or if you would like to continue the conversation later on, feel free to reach out to me, because I'm always interested in learning what's happening in organizations, where it's working, where things are not. So you talk about where we started with the quote from Peter Drucker, right? Culture is strategy for breakfast. So I would start with culture, right? And understanding organizational culture, I think, is extremely important. Like I said, in my career, I spent about 20 years in 2 years in manufacturing, about 19 years in supply chain, transportation, logistics, working within a company. So I led an OR team there, and I got deep into some of these problems. I've been at FICO 5 years now. So at FICO now, I see more breadth. I don't go as deep on each one, but I see it in many different companies. So it's been very interesting over the last 25 years to learn between both and compare and contrast and see what's different and yet see what's common across. So whenever now I go in to any project with any organization, as best I can, coming in from the outside, I'm really trying to understand, the culture within that team. And by culture, what I mean is not, the stuff that's published, like the vision statement, mission statement, or what might be written down. It's those unwritten rules. And one of the best definitions of culture that I've seen is culture is an invisible force. So it's like gravity. When you ignore gravity, you're gonna trip and fall. You can't see it, but it's there, right? So think of culture as an invisible force, and you have to respect it. And I think one of the key things to think about when implementing an OR project is this idea of, we bring something new to the table and we think the new will automatically replace the old. Well, I found more often than not that you have to sort of unlearn the old before people can learn the new. And I think that comes down to some of these cultural aspects of the unwritten rules, right? We talk about like invisible force. So there are these unwritten things. And if you just put the new in with the old, they are coexisting versus one replacing the other. And I would love, in my younger days, I would have loved to thought like, hey, this optimization model is better. So people will forget the old and just absorb the new and jump into it. And I think that was just naive, right? Especially people have been doing something a certain way for a long time. There's habits they have. There's so many other things at play. So you have to find a way for people to unlearn the old before they can learn the new. And also, one of the, I guess, easier things to understand is structure. And structure clearly drives behavior. So understand the structure of the organization. One simple idea would be, there's been a long conversation about should OR groups be centralized or decentralized. Regardless of what answer works in whatever organization, at least knowing what the structure is, and beyond that, even about how other players are structured within the organization will be very important to understand as you're implementing a project, because those could give you hints in terms of where there might be barriers for adoption or where there may be opportunities for success. So do your best to understand the culture by respecting it, and also then diving a little bit deeper as best you can to understand that. The next one is develop trust. And you might say, Zahir, come on, that's pretty basic, right? I mean, everybody knows that you need to develop trust. But I look at it a little bit differently. So the point here is, I like this quote a lot. They don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. When I was trying to implement things in the past, I was trying to show my caring, bringing all the technical skills that I had. But people didn't really understand what I did as much, right? If they were in an operational role, and they didn't quite connect the dots. So they were a little skeptical maybe at times about really where I was coming from. But if I could do something, anything to help them understand that I really cared about them and their problem, regardless of how I did it. I used to remember in my old OR team, sometimes, we would get a problem that somebody would give us and we'd say, that's easy. You just put in a spreadsheet, do this, this, and this. That's not for our team. We're solving bigger, complex problems. And I reject that idea. If that's something you can do to help somebody solve a problem, even if it's in a simple spreadsheet, do it, right? Because nothing earns trust faster than doing something versus talking about doing something. And once you have that trust, it drives adoption. Because if you're explaining something to somebody that they don't completely understand in terms of how optimization works, they have to make a leap, right? From where they are to where they could be. And they don't know how to make that leap. And if they trust you, then they put you in the middle and say, Zahir's helped me out in the past. I trust him. So yeah, let's make that leap and go forward and do something with that. Support, train, monitor, and celebrate. Here I think about complexity. And this idea that going from complexity to simplicity can be done with understanding. So when we would sometimes build models that people say, oh, it's too complex, you got to simplify it. Obviously, you never want to build a model that's more complex than it needs to be, but at the end of the day, the world is complex and the model may need to be complex to actually solve the problem. So I would always struggle with, well, how do I make it less complex and still solve the problem? What I was missing was the fact that sometimes it's just the understanding that the people have, right? So in many cases, you can take something that's complex and then put in some additional understanding, and now it no longer looks as complex as it used to be. We can all relate to that, right? When you were studying something for the first time, you're like, oh my God, this is so complex. But once you understood it, it wasn't so complex anymore. The thing hadn't changed, right? All that changed was your understanding of it. So we used to use things like gamification, things like that, to try to help people make something that was complex more understandable. So that kind of narrowed that distance as well. The what, in our cases, the objective function really is the what, right? You're trying to optimize something, so that's great. But the why is critical. Get beyond the what, try to get people to understand the why this makes sense, and try to make it as personal and as connected to somebody as possible. So we used to do that with, I used to work a lot in dispatch optimization, and drivers were always skeptical about the optimization and how it was going to affect them. And I had to help them understand that for them, it made their life better because of this. And it also helped the corporation better because of this. So it was a win-win for both. And so once they felt better about the why, they were more comfortable doing the what. And then celebrating and recognizing is always a good thing, but especially constructive challengers. So if somebody's pushing back, and you suddenly find that, yes, there was an edge case that they were talking about. Maybe they made it a big deal and it's a small edge case, but still they found something that the model was not covering. Celebrate that. They're a constructive challenger and turn them into heroes, so they can get some buy-in and recognition as well and move forward. The power of metrics, quote by Eli Goldratt, it's really used a lot, right? Tell me how you'll measure me, and I will tell you how I will behave. It's so natural, right, from a human perspective. We had a case where we were building a scheduling model for a production scheduling model, and the supervisor looked at the solution and said, no, I would never do that because you're taking one of my people and moving him to a downstream station. And we explained to him that the optimization model was doing that because that job was on the critical path for many other jobs, and if we didn't complete that, it would have a bigger impact. And he saw it right away. He's like, oh, wow. So the model looks at the whole, wow, that's really great because there's no way I can see all those connections. So he was really happy. And we thought, yay, we had solved the problem. And he said, no, but I still can't do that. So why not? He said, because my boss has told me that we will always first complete all the jobs in our station before we go help out. Well, yeah, of course we want to help out, but first we have to complete all the jobs in our station. And if I make this assignment, then I won't be able to complete the jobs at my station. So how he was being measured was very different than how maybe the vice president who had sort of envisioned this solution was thinking about it. So we had a lot more work to do to really change the metrics. So you got to understand the existing metrics and then design processes to either support them or design new metrics. But old metrics and new metrics cannot sit in the same world at the same time, because when metrics collide, then adoption gets eroded. And lastly, automation versus augmentation. Maybe I should say versus, automation and augmentation. Automation is not automatically better. Many cases, if you do bad automation, it becomes very good ammunition for people that might be pushing back on your models. So automate the reliable as much as possible, because if you automate unreliable things, that's the first thing people will point to and say, see, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. The solution, your model is wrong. So especially what we do with the technology is build in the augmentation, right? We have the capability now to help people run scenarios, things like that. So we automate as much as possible, of course, the reliable stuff, but the things that have uncertainty associated with them, we expose to the users and say, okay, this may be the best information we have from the database, but you can intervene and change some parameters here if you want, and then run the model and maybe clone scenarios and look at them side by side to then see what the solution might be. As soon as you turn it into more of an augmentation mode for a user, they feel like they have more control, even if they come back to the original solution because maybe they were trying to beat the optimal solution and they couldn't. It is still their choice to do that versus Zahir built a model, put it on my plate, and I have to use this as the optimal solution. So I think bringing augmentation more into the picture can make a huge impact in how people adopt these models and become more comfortable with them, and finally start using them to drive the benefit that they're interested in driving. So that's my thoughts on those 5 areas that I hope help with the politics of analytics, and I'd be happy to take any questions.